The fog of London stuck to Baker Street, as if the city itself wanted to hide a secret that was too big to hold. The gas lamps burned with a dull, sad glow, their light eaten up by the moving gray mist that pushed against every window. It was at a time like this that Holmes sat quietly in his armchair, his long fingers touched together under his chin, his eyes closed as if he were listening to sounds that people could not hear. I, his friend who was always with him, could not help but feel that a ghost-like feeling was in the room, waiting to be noticed. Then there was a knock at our door, a knock that was quick, shaky, and strangely quiet. In just a few moments, a story would be told, a story of a disappearance, of suspicion, and of a simple footman who vanished, whose being gone hid more than just a servant not doing his job. What started as a problem in a house would soon show the dark secrets that flowed under London, where every shadow might hide a betrayal and every silence might hide a crime. If mysteries like this excite your imagination, and you find yourself pulled into the world of solving puzzles and gaslit mysteries, then join us in this story by subscribing to the channel. You being here keeps these stories going, and with each like and share, you help us tell more adventures. Let us now step together into the case we are working on. The evening had come with that strange heaviness that only a London fog can bring. The air was thick and wet, pushing against the windows of Baker Street, and the lamps that lined the main street glowed faintly, their light covered up as if by an invisible hand. Inside our familiar living room, the fire in the grate burned low, and the curling smoke of Holmes's pipe rose slowly toward the ceiling, where it hung in moving rings of bluish gray. He sat in his armchair, his long body pulled into himself, his eyes half closed, and his thin fingers touched together with a look of quietly waiting for something. It was the look I knew so well, that strange stillness where every nerve in his mind seemed ready to catch some sudden and unexpected idea. I had been reading lazily through the day's newspaper, finding little that was interesting besides the usual news of political fights and problems in other countries. Holmes, however, seemed to feel something in the very silence of the evening that my slower mind could not notice. "Watson," he said after a while, his voice quiet but sharp, "have you noticed the strangeness of the time?" I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece, which showed 8:30, and shook my head. "Only that it is a very gloomy night," I answered. A faint smile curved his lips. "Exactly. But it is on nights like these, when the city hides itself, that people's lives are likely to show their secret sides. There is a pattern to the trouble men cause, and tonight I believe we will hear it knocking at our door." His words had barely left his lips when a knock, sharp and urgent, was heard in the hallway. I admit I jumped, because the timing was so perfect, it was scary, though Holmes only lifted his eyes with a flash of amusement. Mrs. Hudson brought in a man whose pale face and shaking hands showed he was very upset. He was elderly, his hair was gray like iron, and his uniform clearly showed he was a butler in a big house. He bowed with nervous quickness, his eyes moving from Holmes to me as if he was not sure who he was talking to. "You must forgive me for coming in, gentlemen," he began, his voice shaky. "But I was not told by anyone, no one, except my own conscience to come here tonight. They say there is no man in London so good at solving things, and I can no longer carry the weight of staying silent." Holmes pointed for him to sit, his eyes fixed with that cold, sharp look that could take away a man's every excuse. "Calm yourself, sir. You were wise to come. Start at the beginning, and do not worry about making any unpleasant truth sound better. I am not easily shocked." The butler's hands gripped the arms of the chair, and he breathed in uneven gasps. "It is about a member of our house staff, a footman named Thomas Weller. 3 nights ago, he disappeared. Simply vanished, gentlemen, without even a word or a clue. The master of the house, Sir Reginald Hatherley, believes the boy ran away from his job. But I knew Thomas. He was a loyal fellow, steady and hard-working, not someone who would do something so quickly. And yet, his voice shook and his eyes looked down. And yet, Holmes asked softly, "There are whispers, Mr. Holmes, whispers of arguments downstairs, of strange visitors at odd hours, of voices raised in anger, and now the boy is gone, and everything is quieted down as if it never happened. But I cannot, and will not, believe he just ran away. There is something darker happening in Ashwood Square." When he said that address, Holmes's eyebrow lifted a little. "Ashwood Square, you say? One of those fancy houses on the west side?" The butler nodded. "Number 4, sir, the home of Sir Reginald." Holmes leaned back, smoking his pipe with a thoughtful look. "And what has been done? Has the problem been reported to the police?" "Sir Reginald will not allow it. He says it is a shame to have the police poking into his business over a common servant. He insists Thomas has run away and that the case is closed. But I have worked in that house for 20 years, and I cannot rest while the truth is buried. That is why I have come to you, Mr. Holmes." The firelight cast deep shadows on Holmes's face as he looked at the man in silence. At last he spoke. "Your loyalty is a good thing. Tell me, when was the last time the footman was seen?" "On the evening of Wednesday, sir. He carried a tray to the master's study at 9 o'clock. He did not come back. When the tray was found in the hallway an hour later, the boy was nowhere to be found." "Were the doors and windows locked?" Holmes asked. "They were, sir, but the small gate to the back alley was unlatched in the morning." Holmes tapped his long finger against his chin, his eyes getting narrow. "And what about the household at that time? Did any servant notice an unusual sound or movement?" The butler hesitated. "There was talk, sir, though no one dares to speak it openly. One of the maids swears she heard low voices in the hallway outside the study, and another insists she saw a light flicker in the garden, though no lamp was put there. But no one will repeat these stories in front of the master for fear of making him angry." Holmes stood up suddenly, his tall body casting a thin shadow on the wall. He walked back and forth on the carpet, his pipe held between his teeth, then turned to the butler with sudden energy. "Sir Reginald is wrong to think this problem is not worth looking into. I will come to Ashwood Square tomorrow at sunrise. Until then, not a word of your visit must be heard by anyone in your house. Do you understand?" The man's eyes widened, and he nodded strongly. "I swear it, sir. I have told no one, only you." "Good. You can be sure the case is in good hands." Holmes held out his hand with surprising warmth, and the butler grabbed it as if it were a rope to save him. A moment later he was gone, his footsteps fading down the stairs and into the quiet night. I turned to Holmes with a lot of surprise. "You speak as if the man's fears are real," I said. Holmes's eyes were fixed on the door through which the butler had left, and in the glow of the fire, his eyes shone with the sharp light I knew so well. "My dear Watson," he answered, "the disappearance of a servant in a respectable house might indeed be seen as running away by a man of Sir Reginald's class. But notice the details: the tray left behind, the unlatched gate, the whispers of an argument, the put-out lamp. Each one is small by itself, but together they suggest a plan, not an accident. I smell a conspiracy in this case. Tomorrow we go to Ashwood Square." The silence that followed was broken only by the faint ticking of the clock and the faraway rumble of carriage wheels quieted by the fog. But I could not shake the feeling that something huge and unseen had moved in the city's hidden places, and that Holmes had just placed his hand on the first thread of a web that would turn out to be very dark indeed. The next morning began with a pale, weak light that struggled to get through the fog. London looked like it was wrapped in a gray blanket, its chimneys sticking out like gravestones above a sea of mist. We left early, Holmes walking with his usual energy even in the heavy air, his sharp eyes looking over the street as if each moving shadow hid a clue to the mystery that was waiting for us. I followed close beside him, my mind still thinking about the story of the vanished footman. The butler's haunted face stayed in my thoughts, and I could not get rid of the idea that in his fear was some truth he had not yet told. Our carriage took us to the west. The horses' hooves quieted on the wet cobblestones until we entered the more private neighborhood where Ashwood Square was. It was one of those grand squares built in the last century, its tall houses of dark bricks standing in serious rows around a fenced garden. Even though the fog pushed against its edges, the square kept a look of wealth and being special. It was the kind of place where scandal is both feared and carefully hidden. Number 4, the home of Sir Reginald Hatherley, stood with its front hidden by climbing ivy and its windows covered with curtains to keep out nosy eyes. Holmes paid the driver and walked up the steps with that quick confidence that often surprised strangers before a word was spoken. The door was opened by the same butler who had visited us the night before. His face showed both relief and worry at our arrival. "This way, gentlemen," he whispered, looking nervously behind him as if the very walls might be listening. He led us through a hall with marble tiles, the air heavy with the smell of polish and old wood, until we reached a drawing-room that was richly furnished but dimly lit. Sir Reginald Hatherley stood up from a chair beside the fireplace as we entered. He was a tall, thin man with a face lined by years of being in charge, and maybe too much fun. His gray eyes, sharp and cold, looked at Holmes with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice clipped like someone used to giving orders, "I was not told that my butler had asked for your help. Still, since you are here, please, make your reason for being here clear." Holmes bowed his head with serious politeness. "Your servant came to me because he was concerned about a member of your house staff. A footman, Thomas Weller, has disappeared under circumstances that should be investigated." The baronet's eyebrows came together. "Nonsense, sir. The fellow ran away. Such people are not trustworthy by nature. I will not have the name of my house dirtied by silly gossip or police interference. If he has run away, let him go. Good riddance." Holmes looked at him steadily, his eyes not flinching. "But it is strange, is it not, that a man would leave his job without taking even his coat or his pay? That he would vanish while carrying a tray to your study, leaving it behind without an explanation? The small things are often more telling than the big events, Sir Reginald." The baronet turned red with a hint of anger. "I will not be lectured in my own house. Still, if it entertains you to waste your time on this foolishness, I will not stop you. But I warn you, sir, I will not have my household disturbed." At this moment the door opened again, and Lady Hatherley entered. She was a woman with delicate features and a paleness that seemed made worse by the dim light of the room. Her dark eyes stayed on Holmes with a strange, almost pleading look before she turned to her husband. "Reginald," she said softly, "surely there can be no harm in letting Mr. Holmes look into the matter. It has been a worry for all of us." For a quick second I caught a shake in her voice, a hint of fear that did not match her calm way of speaking. Sir Reginald waved his hand impatiently. "As you wish, though it is completely unreasonable." He walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look into the fog, as if trying to escape from an unwelcome visit. Holmes turned his attention to Lady Hatherley with gentle politeness. "You knew the missing footman well, madam?" She clasped her hands together. "Not well, Mr. Holmes, but he was always respectful, always hard-working. His disappearance has greatly upset the servants. They whisper among themselves, and the house feels different." Her voice shook, and she glanced toward her husband, who stood stiffly by the window. Holmes bowed his head to show he understood. "I would like to see the servants' rooms," he said. The baronet made a sound of annoyance, but did not object, and the butler, clearly relieved, led us away. We went down to the lower floor, where narrow hallways led to kitchens, pantries, and the simple rooms of the household staff. The air was cooler there, with a mix of smells from cooking, coal, and damp stone. Several servants stood aside as we passed, their eyes wide with worry, their whispers stopping as we came near. Holmes moved with quiet precision, noticing every detail, the scuff marks of boots on the floor, the way plates were arranged on his shelf, even the faint breeze that moved a loose corner of the carpet. At last we entered the small room once used by Thomas Weller. It was simply furnished, a narrow bed neatly made, a wooden chest at its foot, and a small table with a stub of a candle on it. Holmes looked in the chest, which held only a few shirts, worn boots, and a pocket Bible. Nothing suggested he had left in a hurry. He bent over the table, where faint scorch marks ruined the surface. "Strange," he murmured, running his long fingers across the wood. He crossed to the fireplace, where the ashes of burnt paper were thinly scattered. With delicate care, he stirred them with the poker, lifting a piece to the light. It was too burnt to show any words, but Holmes's face grew sharp, as if he understood the meaning just from the act of destruction. "Something has been destroyed here," he said softly. "A letter, perhaps, or a note burnt not days ago, but within the last evening. Look, Watson, how the ash still holds its shape before falling apart." From under the bed, Holmes pulled a small object, a silver cufflink, strangely fancy for a servant. Its design had the initial R wrapped with ivy leaves. "Not his own, for sure," Holmes remarked, turning it in his fingers. "Tell me, my good man," he asked the butler, "does Sir Reginald wear such jewelry?" The butler's face turned pale. "He does, sir. They were a gift from Lady Hatherley." Holmes slipped the cufflink into his pocket without a word. He then bent down once more, his sharp eyes fixed on a faint stain on the stone floor near the door. He touched it lightly, then looked at his fingertip. Not wine, not ink. Blood, though very little of it. He stood up, his face serious. "This is no simple case of running away, Watson." The butler's hands trembled as he clasped them in front of him. "God save us," he whispered. Holmes turned to me, his face lit up with that fierce energy I had seen, only when a case began to show its hidden shape. "We have only lifted the corner of the curtain," he said. "There is more here than even our loyal friend suspects. The silence of this household speaks louder than any witness." As we went up once more to the higher rooms, I could not shake the feeling that the house itself was thinking about some secret guilt. The servants' eyes avoided ours. Lady Hatherley's gaze lingered with a troubled light, and Sir Reginald stood stiff and unwelcoming, as if daring us to pry further. But under it all ran a hidden feeling of fear, a sense that the disappearance of the footman was just the outward sign of a darkness that was coiled deep inside the house of Ashwood Square. Holmes and I stayed a while longer inside the stuffy house of Ashwood Square. The household, though it looked calm, seemed to hold a restlessness inside its very walls, a kind of whispered shaking that no stern look from Sir Reginald could completely quiet. Lady Hatherley had gone to her room, saying she was tired, while the baronet stayed in the drawing-room with a look of grumpy pride, leaving Holmes free to prowl the lower rooms without being challenged. I admit that my own spirits were low. The chill of the stone hallways, the worried looks of the servants, and the faint, lingering smell of a put-out fire, all combined to make me feel the seriousness of the situation. Holmes, however, did well in such an atmosphere. His movements grew sharper, more purposeful, and each pause of his thin body before. Some small detail showed the working of that amazing mind which made connections where other men saw only confusion. We returned to the footman's room, where the bits of burnt paper still clung to the fireplace. Holmes sat down on the narrow bed, the cufflink shining in his fingers. "Watson," he said, "what do you think of this little thing?" I looked at it closely. "It is finely made, far too nice for what a servant could afford. If it belongs to Sir Reginald, then it being here is very strange." but I can imagine that it may have been dropped by accident." Holmes smiled faintly. "An excellent observation. But think about this. This room is hardly ever visited by the master of the house. For his jewelry to be under the bed of a footman suggests either that he broke in or there was a struggle. I think it was the first, because the mark on the stone floor was small, not violent. But let us not build stories in the air. We must collect facts like a bee gathers honey, carefully, without hurry." He stood up and bent down once more over the ashes. With amazing patience, he pulled out several blackened pieces and laid them on the table. Though most were unreadable, one had a bit of ink where the flame had not touched a corner. With his magnifying glass, Holmes bent over it, his face tightening with focus. "Note here, Watson, these letters, then at once, and here the faint curve of an R. The message, whatever its full meaning, was urgent. Someone was called, perhaps in secret." The butler, who had been waiting in the hallway, stepped forward shyly. "I swear to you, gentlemen, no one of the servants could have written it. The handwriting is fancy. See the swirls of the letters." Holmes looked at him with cool distance. "You are observant. Yes, this was not the writing of a common boy. It suggests a writer used to more serious letters. The question becomes, who was it written to, and why was it burnt in such a hurry?" The butler crossed himself nervously, but Holmes sent him away with a nod. When we were alone, my friend moved to the narrow window that looked over the garden. The fog pushed against the glass, making the shapes of ivy and the gravel path blurry. The maid who said she saw a light flicker here may not be far from the truth, Holmes thought aloud. A lantern in the hands of a visitor, perhaps, or a signal from inside. He tapped the windowsill. The ground shows no footprints now, but 3 nights ago the dirt may well have had them. As he spoke, the door opened a tiny bit, and a young maid peeked in with wide, frightened eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered, "but I saw him. I swear it. On the night Thomas went missing, I saw a man in a cloak standing by the garden gate. He turned when he saw me and slipped away into the fog. I told Mrs. Cleeve, but she told me to keep my mouth shut, or I might lose my job." Holmes moved toward her with a gentleness that did not match his intensity. "You did well to speak now. Could you describe this man?" She shook her head. "Too dark, sir. Only that he was tall and wore his cloak pulled up high. But I thought I heard the creak of wheels soon after, as if a carriage was waiting." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Thank you, child. That is very helpful. Say nothing more of it to anyone in the house." The girl ran away as quickly as she had appeared, leaving behind a silence heavy with meaning. Holmes turned to me. A cloaked man, a waiting carriage, a burnt note, the master's cufflink, and a trace of blood. Piece by piece, Watson. The picture grows, but it is still blurry, like a lantern seen through fog. We left the room, returning once more to the big hall above. Sir Reginald met us there, his face dark with anger. "Well, Mr. Holmes, have you found my runaway footman hiding under a coal bucket?" Holmes met his gaze calmly. "No, Sir Reginald. I've discovered enough to assure me that your servant did not leave on his own. Whether he left by force or by a plan remains to be seen. I will return tomorrow to continue my investigation." The baronet's face turned red with anger. "You are overstepping your bounds, sir. I will not have my house turned upside down by meddling. I have put up with you out of politeness, but I warn you, push further, and you will regret it." Holmes bowed his head as if accepting a small comment. "I push only as far as the truth forces me, Sir Reginald. Good evening." We left the house in silence, the butler's worried face the last to disappear behind the closing door. The fog had gotten thicker, wrapping the square in darkness. As we walked, I turned to Holmes. "You believe the baronet knows more than he is telling?" Holmes took a long smoke from his pipe before answering. He knows or he is afraid, Watson. Notice his anger. A man who is truly innocent meets an investigation with indifference, not fury. And consider the cufflink. If it was really his, how did it get there? No, there is some hidden secret under this household's calm. I suspect the vanished footman stumbled upon it and paid the price. The thought chilled me, and for a time we walked in silence, except for the quieted beat of hooves and the hiss of the fog. But I felt, as I had not felt in many cases before, that we stood on the edge of something darker than just a servant's disappearance. There was a sense of unseen forces moving around us, like shadows gliding unseen through the London mist. Holmes stopped suddenly at a corner, his body sharp in the gaslight. "Watson," he said, "make a note. The carriage. We must learn who hires carriages near Ashwood Square at such late hours. Tomorrow we will start at the carriage stands. Somewhere in this fog rides the man who knows the truth of Thomas Weller's fate." And with that decision, we turned toward home, the echo of his words following us through the darkened streets until Baker Street finally welcomed us once more. But as I lay awake that night, I could not get rid of the image of that burnt note, its desperate words half-eaten by fire, its message forever unfinished, and the thought that a footman's simple life had become tangled in matters too dangerous for any common man. The next day started little brighter than the last, for the fog had barely lifted, and the streets of London lay under a pale light that made every color dull and every sound quiet. Holmes, not bothered, was out at an early hour, moving with his usual restless energy. We had decided to return to Ashwood Square to follow the clues of our investigation, though my friend had already decided that the investigation must go beyond the walls of that dark household. As we approached the square once more, I noticed how its very look seemed different to my eyes. The grand houses seemed to be hiding something, their shuttered windows like watchful eyes, their ivy-covered fronts like veils pulled close. Holmes stopped at the railing of the garden, his gaze sweeping over the gravel paths and damp grass before he walked not toward number 4, but toward the house next door at number 5. "Holmes," I said, "do you plan to visit a neighbor?" "Indeed, Watson," he answered. "A house does not exist by itself. Its walls may hide much, but the eyes across the way or beside it often see what its own master cannot hide. If a shadow moves at an hour when good people are in bed, who is more likely to notice it than a watchful neighbor?" He had barely rung the bell when the door was opened by a parlor-maid, who led us into a simple, though well-kept drawing-room. Soon, a lady in her middle years entered with sharp features, and a look that mixed curiosity with suspicion. She greeted us with a certain stiff politeness. "You must forgive this intrusion, madam," Holmes began, bowing slightly. "We are involved in an investigation concerning recent events at number 4, and we thought perhaps as a neighbor you might have noticed something of interest." The lady's eyes gleamed at once with that strange light I have so often seen in those who love to tell the secrets of others. "Indeed, sir," she said, sitting down with a look of importance. "I have lived here for 12 years and have seen much that others miss. As for number 4, I've long suspected that all is not as it should be under that roof." Holmes bowed his head encouragingly. "Please continue, madam. What in particular makes you suspicious?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice, though no one but us was there. "It was 3 nights ago, sir, the very night the footman is said to have vanished. I was woken from my rest by a very unusual sound. It was near midnight, and I heard voices raised in anger. They seemed to come from the servants' entrance, which is clearly visible from my upper window. When I looked out, I saw a cloaked man standing there, waving his arms with great anger. Soon the door opened, and the man slipped inside. Not long after, I saw a light moving across the garden as if someone carried a lantern. And then, not 10 minutes later, A carriage rolled away from the back gate. Its wheels quieted as if on purpose. Her story matched the maid's whispered words very closely, and I could not help but feel a thrill of proof. Holmes, however, stayed calm, his gaze fixed sharply on the lady's face. "You are certain of the time, madam?" "Quite certain. I keep a clock by my bedside, and I noticed it at the time. It was 10 minutes to 12. And the carriage? Did you see any mark or uniform?" She pursed her lips. "No, sir. The fog was thick, and the lamps gave but little light, but I could swear the driver wore a tall hat and kept his face turned away." Holmes's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of his chair. "You have been most helpful. One last question. Have you ever before noticed visitors at such strange hours?" The lady's expression grew sly. "On more than one occasion, sir. There have been gentlemen who came late and left early, though never before with such a commotion. Sir Reginald is a man of high position, but I have sometimes thought his business more varied than his dignity would suggest." Holmes stood up, bowing once more. "You have my thanks, madam. I assure you, your watchfulness will not go unrewarded." When we had left the house and stood once more in the foggy square, I turned to my friend with excitement. "Surely this confirms the maid's story. A visitor entered, a carriage left, and all at the very hour of the footman's disappearance. Can there be any doubt that Thomas Weller was carried away against his will?" Holmes looked at me with a faint smile. "Your conclusion is very natural, Watson, but let us not jump too quickly. That a carriage left, we can be sure of. Whether it carried the footman alive or not is yet to be proven. Still, the fact that the stories match is very interesting. We must now find the driver, for he holds the clue that will pull the curtain aside." We returned to number 4 to ask more questions, though Sir Reginald met us with a bad mood, his annoyance barely hidden. Lady Hatherley, pale and quiet, avoided our eyes, and the servants backed away from our questions, as if fearing some hidden punishment. Holmes, with his endless patience, made careful notes of their words, but I saw in his face that he had learned little more than their fear. As we left, he stopped at the gate, his eyes looking at the cobblestones where the carriage had rolled. "The iron rim of a wheel leaves its kiss on the stone, Watson," he murmured, pointing to a faint groove half lost in the dirt. "A narrow wheel recently passed. Notice how it turns slightly, as if to avoid being seen. A small sign, but it tells me that our cloaked visitor did not come just to call on Sir Reginald for tea." We walked on in silence, the fog curling around us, a city's quieted sounds drifting from far away. I could not shake the image of that cloaked man slipping into the house, or the thought of the carriage that stole away into the night. Wherever it had gone, it had taken with it the secret of Thomas Weller's fate. And in that moment, I felt with a certainty that chilled my blood that the case had grown larger than the disappearance of a humble servant. It hinted at forces that moved in silence, under the cover of night and fog, their plans hidden from the common eye. Holmes's voice broke the silence. "There is more at stake here than the honor of a household, Watson. We must walk carefully, because in following this carriage, we may find ourselves on a road that leads into the very heart of London's darker secrets." It was on the 3rd morning after the butler's unexpected visit that we found ourselves once more on the familiar road to Scotland Yard. The fog had thinned at last, though the city still carried that heavy, sooty air which seems never to leave London. Holmes walked with a strange lightness, as if he sensed the chase was getting closer. For my own part, I felt a certain worry, for I knew too well the clash that often happened when Holmes's careful thinking met the clumsy work of the police. We had barely entered the yard before Inspector Lestrade himself came out of his office, his thin body bustling with that energy which was his trademark. His small, ferret-like eyes brightened at the sight of us, though his manner had the familiar mix of respect and annoyance. "Holmes," he exclaimed, By Jove, I thought you'd be on this case before long. The whole thing is nothing more than a servant who's run off, but half the town is in a panic over it." Holmes took off his gloves with deliberate calm. "Good morning, Lestrade." I did not suppose that the police worried about such small things, since Sir Reginald has tried to keep the matter from official notice. Lestrade's brow wrinkled. "And that, Mr. Holmes, is the strange part. We heard whispers, carriage wheels at unholy hours, cloaked men at servants' doors, and so on. The press has already begun to sniff around, and if they smell a scandal in a baronet's household, we will have enough trouble. I was about to send a man down to Ashwood Square, but seeing you on the trail, I may as well save the effort. Still, I warn you, Holmes, if this turns into more than a missing servant, the police will take the lead." Holmes's thin lips curved into a mean smile. "By all means, Lestrade, claim the victory when the battle is won. For now, however, you may find the ground somewhat rocky." I was afraid the conversation might get worse, but Holmes changed the subject with his usual skill. "Tell me, what questions have been asked at the carriage stands? For I have reason to believe that a carriage left number 4 on the night of Weller's disappearance." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Ah, so you've heard that too. We've asked among the drivers near Oxford Street, but none admitted to carrying a passenger from Ashwood Square at that hour. Still, these fellows are careful about admitting anything that might bring trouble. They'll lie as easily as they'll whip their horses." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Still, being persistent may get results. There are clues, Lestrade, if one has eyes to see them. Narrow wheels, a quieted axle, a tall driver who keeps his face turned away. These are not details that every witness misses." Lestrade gave a grunt. "You and your details, Holmes. Well, if you can make something of them, you'll be the first." We left soon after, Holmes refusing to waste more words in argument. As we walked back toward Baker Street, I could not help but say, "Lestrade speaks as if the case were no more than a passing bother. Yet you see it with such seriousness. Do you truly believe, Holmes, that the fate of one simple footman can hide plans of greater importance?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with that fierce light which always signaled the thrill of the chase. "My dear Watson, never underestimate the value of a single life in the pattern of a crime. A footman may stumble upon what emperors would hide. Consider the burnt note, the baronet's fury, the neighbor's story, and the carriage that vanished into the fog. Each in itself is a small thing. Together, they are the beginnings of a conspiracy. I tell you, the disappearance of Thomas Weller is the ripple on the surface from a stone thrown deep into the waters of London." That afternoon we continued our questions among the cab drivers, wandering from stand to stand, questioning drivers with a persistence that would have tired a lesser man. Most shrugged us off with indifference, swore they had been somewhere else, or laughed at the idea of secret passengers. But at last, near Portland Place, we met a fellow whose uneasy looks gave him away. Holmes talked to him quietly, and though the man was unwilling, a gold coin secretly passed into his hand loosened his tongue. "Aye, sir," he muttered, keeping his voice low. "It was 3 nights ago. I was called near Ashwood Square, close to midnight, by a tall gentleman in a cloak with a young fellow beside him. The boy looked pale and not too steady on his feet, as if he'd been hit or drugged. They told me to drive to the river near Wapping and to ask no questions. I thought little of it, for such rides are not uncommon in this city. But when I heard talk of a missing footman, I put 2 and 2 together, and that's all I know, sir, on my honor." Holmes's eyes flashed. "You have served justice well. Remember, speak of this to no man except me." As we left the stand, Holmes walked in silence for some moments, his long steps quickening. At last he spoke, his tone low and intense. "There, Watson. The carriage, the cloaked man, the destination. Wapping, a place of shadows and river fog, where a man might vanish as though swallowed by the Thames River itself. We are nearer to the truth than Sir Reginald would wish. I felt a chill run through me at his words. The image of the poor footman, pale and unsteady, driven through the midnight streets toward the river's edge, haunted my imagination. What had happened to him there? What hands had grabbed him? And for what purpose? The questions pressed upon me, but Holmes's face was set with grim determination, and I knew he already saw further than I could understand. That evening, as we sat once more before the fire of Baker Street, Holmes laid out his plan. Tomorrow, Watson, we go to Wapping. There lies the trail, and we must follow it, though it leads us into the very hideouts of the river thieves. Lestrade will follow in time, but for now the matter is ours. We must walk carefully, for those who cloak themselves in fog and burn their letters do not hesitate at violence. His words sank heavily into my heart. I could not forget the paleness of Lady Hatherley, the grumpy defiance of her husband, or the frightened whispers of the servants. All were threads woven into a pattern dark and evil, and though I longed to believe the footman was still alive, a bad feeling told me that we were already too late to save him. Yet if Holmes had any such thought, he hid it, and his sharp eyes shone only with resolve as he bent once more over his maps and notes, planning the next day's trip into the riverside maze. The following day was one of those gloomy times when the sky presses down upon London with the weight of lead. Though the fog had lifted a little, the air still had that damp chill which creeps into a man's bones and makes every sound hollow. Holmes was unusually silent as we had breakfast, his thoughts clearly taken up by the idea of our search along the riverside. Yet before we could leave for Wapping, a note arrived at Baker Street, carried by the trembling hand of the Ashwood Square butler. "Mr. Holmes, sir," he said, out of breath, "you must come at once. There has been a disturbance in the master's study. A maid swears she found something hidden, something the master would have destroyed if he had found it. For pity's sake, sir, come before it is lost." Holmes stood up instantly, his thin body tense with expectation. "Watson, our path turns once more to Ashwood Square. The river must wait. There is more to be dug up within those walls before we risk the fogs of Wapping." Within the hour, we stood again before the scary house. Sir Reginald met us with poorly hidden anger, his voice sharp as he declared, "I will not have this constant interruption, Holmes. You have no right to be here." Holmes bowed his head with that air of quiet control which no angry outburst could shake. "Right, sir, is found where truth lies hidden. If you have nothing to hide, my presence should trouble you no more than a draught at the window." Lady Hatherley, pale and shaky, waited in the background. Her eyes, dark with unspoken fears, met mine for a second before looking away. The butler quickly showed us to the study, a dark room lined with books and lit dimly through heavy curtains. He whispered, "It was the maid who found it, sir." While scrubbing near the fireplace, she noticed a corner of the carpet was raised, and under it, Holmes dropped to his knees without waiting for more. With quick fingers, he turned back the thick rug, showing a loose board in the polished floor. He pried it gently aside and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased, but still whole. "Ah!" Holmes's eyes glittered as he smoothed the piece of paper on the desk. The writing was hurried, the ink smudged in places, but still readable. Together we bent over it and read the words. They know. "The house is no longer safe. If I am taken, tell R to burn the papers. Midnight is too late." The message broke off suddenly, the final strokes jagged, as if written in a hurry or in fear. Holmes tapped the page with his long finger. "Look, Watson. The urgency is clear. Someone in these walls feared being found and destroyed. The initial, R. We can probably guess what that means. And notice the warning. Midnight is too late. What happened at midnight, Watson? The carriage, the cloaked man, The disappearance of Weller. My heart beat faster as the pieces fell into their dark pattern. Then the footman may have found this message? Just so. He may have stumbled upon what was never meant for his eyes, and in that moment his fate was decided. Sir Reginald had followed us into the study, his face pale with anger. "I will not allow this prying into private matters," he thundered. "That note is a fake, a servant's trick to bring trouble upon this house. I demand you return it at once." Holmes stood up slowly, the paper held lightly between his fingers. His voice was cold and exact. "A fake, sir, would show itself in the ink, in the paper, in the handwriting. This has all the marks of being real, and your anger shows more than just wounded pride. I advise you to calm yourself, because the truth will come out whether you want it to or not." Lady Hatherley gave a sudden low cry, her hand pressed to her lips. For 1 second I thought she would speak, but her husband's angry look silenced her, and she sank trembling into a chair. Holmes slipped the note into his pocket. "This piece of paper, Watson, is worth more than a dozen stories. It connects the vanishing of a servant to the actions of his masters. There are papers important enough to be burnt, dangerous enough to cost a man his freedom. The clue is not just in Wapping, but here, under this very roof." The butler wrung his hands in sadness. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you, do not give up on this. Thomas was a good boy, and if he has suffered for another man's guilt—" Holmes's face softened. "Rest assured, my good fellow, I will not give up on it. We have one clue, and I will pull until the whole picture is laid bare." We left the house soon after, Sir Reginald refusing to let us in again, his rage barely controlled. But Lady Hatherley's shocked expression stayed in my mind. I could not help but believe that she knew something her husband wanted to bury, and that the truth weighed on her like a chain she could neither break nor admit to. As we walked back through the foggy streets, Holmes was silent for a time, his gaze fixed inward. At last he said, "There is a secret code in this case, Watson, and we now hold the key. The burnt papers, the warning note, the quieted carriage. These are not the leftovers of a family fight, but the workings of a plan that involves things beyond Ashwood Square. We stand on the edge of a discovery, and tomorrow we will go to Wapping, where shadows gather thickest." I confess that a chill ran through me at his words, for though Holmes spoke with his usual calm confidence, I could not shake the fear that we were being pulled into secrets darker than either of us yet knew. The image of the note, its desperate writing breaking off into silence, haunted me as the lamps of Baker Street appeared once more through the growing mist. The next evening found us heading east, leaving behind the respectable darkness of Marylebone for the moving shadows of the riverside. London, in its vastness, seemed to change its character with each turning street. The wide roads gave way to narrower lanes where the lamps sputtered weakly, and the fog hung in clumps that caught the light like veils of smoke. Holmes had insisted we travel by carriage, not just for speed, but to watch the stands where cab drivers gathered, because he believed that the coach which took the footman away might still be traced by its movements through the city. We stopped at a stand near the tower, where a line of cab drivers stood gossiping under the glow of a tavern sign. Holmes got out, his gaze sweeping over the group with that quiet authority which so often made strangers reveal more than they meant to. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said, taking out a cigarette case with a gesture as casual as it was planned. "A cold night for waiting. Perhaps you might warm it with a story or two." Coins shone between his fingers, and soon enough the men were competing to speak. Most offered nothing more than tales of argumentative passengers or drunken rides. But one, a heavy-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, hesitated when Holmes described the tall cloaked man and his unsteady friend. I carried such a pair," he muttered at last, his voice low. "It was near midnight, 4 nights ago. Took them from Ashwood Square, down toward the riverside. paid me double to keep my mouth shut. "Where did you drop them off?" Holmes asked quietly. "By the old warehouses near St. Catherine's docks. Place is nearly empty now, except for river workers and those who don't want their business known." Holmes pressed the coin into his hand with a nod of thanks, then turned to me with that fierce gleam in his eyes. "Watson, the fog is our friend tonight. Come, let us see what shadow our carriage cast." We dismissed our cab and walked on foot into the maze of alleys that led to the river. The fog thickened, rolling in off the Thames with a damp chill that clung to our coats. The great cranes looked like skeletons against the dim sky, and the warehouses, long unused, stood in silence, broken only by the lap of water against the dock. I admit my heart beat faster with worry, for the place smelled of secrecy, and I knew too well that violence could happen unseen in such areas. Holmes moved quickly, his long body darting from shadow to shadow, stopping often to kneel on the cobblestones or check the moss-covered steps that led to the water's edge. At last he stopped before a warehouse whose doors hung crookedly on rusted hinges. "Here, Watson," he murmured. "Notice the wheel tracks in the mud, fresh even though the rain has fallen since. And here, a footprint, deep and uneven, as if the man were dragged or unsteady." We entered carefully. The air inside was heavy with dampness and rot, the wooden beams creaking overhead as if carrying an invisible weight. Holmes's lantern cast a narrow beam that danced across broken crates and thrown-away rope. He moved forward methodically, his sharp eyes darting to every corner. Suddenly, he bent down and lifted something from the floor. A torn piece of cloth, rough and stained. "The uniform of a footman," he said softly. "We are on the very track, Watson." At that instant, a sound reached us. The faint creak of a board, the almost unnoticeable shuffle of feet. Holmes put out the lantern at once, and we stood in darkness, except for the dim glow that came through cracks in the wall. The silence pressed on us, broken only by the river's murmur. Then, from the far end of the warehouse, came a whisper of movement, followed by the hollow slam of a door. Holmes darted forward, his steps swift and silent. I followed as best I could, my revolver held ready. We came out into an alley, just in time to glimpse a figure melting into the fog, his cloak blowing as he vanished between the shadows of two buildings. Holmes sprang after him, the chase carrying us through a maze of twisting hallways, past piles of wood and rusted anchors, until the sound of carriage wheels reached our ears once more. "There!" Holmes cried, his voice sharp with urgency. Through the moving veil of fog, we saw the shape of a cab lurching into motion, its driver hunched low on his seat. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the cobblestones as it picked up speed, and inside the cab we glimpsed a blur of movement. A shape pressed against the window for a second, then was gone. We gave chase, but the narrow lanes were better for the carriage. It clattered away, swallowed by the night, leaving only the echo of wheels and the sharp smell of horse sweat behind. Holmes stopped at last, his chest rising and falling, though his expression was more grim than tired. "They are watchful, Watson. They know we are following. This is no random disappearance. It is a plan carefully made, and tonight we have brushed against its outer edge." We made our way back through the fog, the weight of failure heavy on me. Yet Holmes seemed almost energized, his mind racing. "Did you notice the figure at the window?" he asked as we reached the wider streets. "I did," I answered, though my vision had been cloudy. "A shape only, no face." "Yet it was enough," Holmes said. "Whether friend or prisoner, the carriage showed its secret openly. They are desperate now, forced to run. That is their weakness, Watson, and it is through that weakness we will strike." As we called for a cab for Baker Street, I could not help but shiver at the thought of the cloaked man, the quieted carriage, and the unknown fate of poor Thomas Weller. The fog seemed to cling more heavily than ever, as if London itself was plotting to hide the truth. But beside me Holmes sat stiffly, his eyes burning with resolve, and I knew that whatever happened, the chase was far from over. The events at Wapping weighed heavily on my mind, but Holmes returned to Baker Street with a kind of grim satisfaction, as if the failure to catch the carriage had only made him hungrier for the hunt. He spent much of the night walking around the room, his long body moving in restless circles, the glow of the fire casting shadows that leaped across the walls. Sometimes he would stop to write notes or look at a map of the city, while I, tired from the chase, could only watch with a mix of admiration and worry. By morning, Holmes had returned to his usual calm, though his eyes kept that fierce brightness which never failed to signal that he was in the middle of a chase. "Watson," he said as we had breakfast, "there are two Londons, living side by side, but seldom touching. One is the London of Sir Reginald Hatherley, polished, respectable, and outwardly calm. The other is the London of taverns, alleys, and whispers, where the truth of power is spoken more freely than in Parliament. We will go today to the Strand, where rumor and fact mix like smoke in a breeze. There we may learn more about our vanished footman than in a dozen interviews with his superiors." So we set out, the fog thinner than before, but still draping the city in its sad veil. The Strand was busy with life despite the hour. Newsboys cried the latest headlines. Carriages rattled along the cobblestones, and shop fronts showed their goods to the steady stream of people passing by. But under the noise was a current of gossip, swift and invisible, carried from mouth to mouth, from tavern to coffee house, from newspaper to street corner. Holmes guided us with perfect instinct to a pub often visited by cab drivers and porters, where the air was thick with tobacco smoke, and the chatter of working men filled the room. Holmes ordered ale with a casualness that hid his purpose, and soon enough his sharp ears were listening to the talk around us. It was not long before a name caught my attention: Ashwood Square. One man, leaning heavily on the counter, lowered his voice as if enjoying the drama of his story. "Mark my words, there's something strange at number 4. They say the footman there was no ordinary servant, but a messenger of sorts, carrying letters for gentlemen who'd pay a lot to keep their business dark." Another laughed rudely. "A spy in a uniform, eh? Well, he spied his last, if the stories are true. Word is he crossed the wrong master and found himself bundled into a carriage heading for the river." Holmes's hand tightened on his glass, though his face showed nothing. "Interesting," he murmured to me. "Notice how rumor adds to the truth. They have heard about Weller's fate, though twisted through the lens of gossip. But even a twisted story may show the outline of reality." We moved from tavern to tavern, Holmes questioning with skill, his manner always changing to match his company, friendly with the cab drivers, joking with the porters, serious with the clerks who read their papers aloud. The story repeated itself in different forms. Thomas Weller, the missing footman, was said to have carried important letters, maybe even about treason. Some whispered he had knowledge of money scandals that involved the highest people. Others hinted at foreign spies moving through London pretending to be diplomats. All agreed on one point, that his disappearance was no accident, but the result of a hand determined to silence him. Late in the afternoon, we stopped at a coffee house where the better sort of gossip was collected. Men of letters and journalists who were proud of knowing what was whispered behind club doors. Holmes unfolded a paper left on the table and pointed to a small article buried among the foreign news. It read, "Mysterious absence. Rumors continue about the sudden disappearance of a servant from a distinguished household in the west of London. Though some dismiss it as unimportant, others say that the man knew information of a sensitive nature. Authorities refuse to comment." Holmes folded the paper with a flick of his fingers. "There you have it, Watson. The press sniffs cautiously at the trail, unwilling to name names, but eager to hint. Once a rumor is printed, it becomes more real. Mark my words, the police will soon be forced to act, though Lestrade hates to admit it. As we stepped back into the bustling Strand, I felt the weight of the city pressing on me. The endless flow of voices, each carrying a piece of truth or lies, each joining into the great wave of guessing. It seemed to me that Thomas Weller's fate had become a kind of shadow cast over London itself, his humble position made bigger by the mysteries that clung to his disappearance. Holmes called for a cab, and as we rode back toward Baker Street, he leaned close. "Do you see the danger, Watson?" The footman was not a pawn in his own game. He stumbled into a game played by men far above him, a game of secrets and silence. If he carried papers, they may yet show up, and what they say could shake reputations, maybe even government offices. That is why the hand that struck him down moves with such urgency. They fear being exposed more than they fear justice. His words chilled me, because I saw in them a glimpse of the larger plan he had hinted at before. What had begun with a knock on our door, and the plea of a faithful butler, had grown into something huge and dangerous. A web that stretched from servants' halls to the drawing-rooms of power, and perhaps even beyond the borders of England itself. That night, as I wrote down these notes by lamplight, I could not get rid of the sense that we were no longer just looking for the fate of a missing man. We were intruding on the hidden machinery of secret plots, where one misstep might bring ruin, not only upon ourselves, but upon those who trusted us. But in Holmes's steady gaze, I found comfort, for he faced the darkness as a man might face the wind, unbowed, relentless, and certain of his path. The days that followed brought with them a strange tension, as if the very air of Baker Street had become charged with the weight of unseen forces. Holmes spent long hours in silence, looking over the pieces of evidence we had gathered, the burnt note, the silver cufflink, the stories of neighbors and cab drivers. He moved between his desk and the fire like a restless spirit, his sharp profile carved in shadow against the lamplight. I asked questions from time to time, but his answers were short, and I knew better than to press him when his mind was running in such deep thoughts. At last, on the third evening, he spoke. "Watson, the clues are coming together. What began as a servant's disappearance has pulled in names and reasons that few would dare to whisper. But whisper they do, in the Strand, in taverns, in the pages of cautious newspapers. The storm is gathering, and if we are not quick, it will break upon us before we are ready." Even as he spoke, the bell at our door rang sharply, and Mrs. Hudson brought in Inspector Lestrade. The police officer's face was tired, his usual quick confidence clouded by worry. He dropped into a chair with a grunt. "Holmes, this business has grown beyond a joke. The papers won't let it rest, and I have bosses breathing down my neck. They demand answers, and I have none to give. What devil's game are you playing at in Ashwood Square?" Holmes looked at him coolly. "No game, Lestrade, but a search for truth. Tell me, what do the police truly fear? Is it scandal or something deeper?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "You have the devil's own talent for sniffing out what others would bury. Between us, Holmes, there's talk of foreign involvement in this. The missing footman may have stumbled onto papers not meant for him, papers tied to deals across the sea. If that's true, it's no longer a matter for me alone. There are men above me who would rather see the whole thing hidden than risk it being exposed." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Exactly as I suspected. But hiding the truth will not change it. The boy is gone, and until we learn whether he is alive or lies in the Thames, the problem continues." Lestrade drummed his fingers on the table. "I'll give you what freedom I can, Holmes, but I warn you, tread carefully. You're meddling in waters that drown men." With that, he left, leaving behind a feeling of worry that stayed long after the door closed. Holmes stood at the window, looking out at the fog-dimmed street. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have reached the heart of the maze. Sir Reginald's fury, Lady Hatherley's fear, the cloaked visitor at midnight. These are not pieces of a family argument. They are signs of a larger plan in which poor Weller was just an unknowing pawn. The police fear foreign secrets. I fear something more personal, betrayal within the household itself. The following day, we returned once more to Ashwood Square. Sir Reginald met us with his usual unfriendliness, but it was Lady Hatherley who drew my attention. She seemed more delicate than ever, her pale face shadowed by sleepless nights, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. When her husband was called away for some reason, she turned to Holmes with sudden desperation. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you must find him. Thomas was more than a servant. He was a good soul, loyal and kind. He did not deserve this fate. My husband forbids me to speak, but silence is worse than guilt. I cannot tell you all, but know this. There are letters hidden still, which others would pay a lot of money to destroy. They are not my husband's alone, but the weight of them lies upon this house." Before Holmes could answer, the door opened, and Sir Reginald re-entered, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Lady Hatherley fell silent, and the moment was lost. But her words had struck deep, and I saw the flash of victory in Holmes's gaze. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out the case before me in its simple facts. "We have," he said, "a servant vanished, a master desperate to stop the investigation, a mistress trembling under a burden she cannot speak of, a note warning of discovery, and rumors of letters tied to secret deals. The storm is gathering, Watson, and when it breaks, it will not be gentle." His words proved to be true, for just 2 nights later, as I sat at my desk, there was a sudden rattling at our door. The butler of Ashwood Square staggered in, his face white as a sheet, his breath ragged. "Mr. Holmes, come quickly. The house is in an uproar. A maid found a second note hidden under the lining of a drawer. Sir Reginald is raging like a madman, and the mistress has fainted. I fear what may happen if you do not step in." Holmes grabbed his hat and cloak with the quickness of a soldier called to battle. "Watson, the storm has broken. Come, we must face it." And so it was that we hurried once more through the gaslit streets, the night pressing close around us, the sense of a coming crisis heavy in the air. I did not know what we would find at Ashwood Square, but in Holmes's steady walk, I felt both fear and excitement. For the case of the vanished footman had dropped its disguise of being unimportant, and now showed itself as a drama, whose final act would shake more than one household before its end. We reached Ashwood Square under a sky heavy with clouds, the lamps along the railings casting only a weak glow through the damp night air. Already we could sense the trouble inside number 4. The butler met us at the door with wild eyes, and behind him the house murmured with voices raised in fear and anger. Holmes moved past him without stopping, his thin body cutting through the confusion with a power no one dared to question. I followed close, my heart beating with a fearful certainty that the final moment of the case was upon us. Sir Reginald met us in the study, his face pale and twisted with rage. A crumpled piece of paper lay on the desk, and his hand trembled as he pointed to it. "This is an outrage," he cried. "A fake, planted to ruin my name. I will not stand for it, Holmes. I will not." Holmes lifted the paper with delicate fingers, smoothing its creases. His eyes scanned the words quickly, and he read aloud in a voice that reached every corner of the room. "They have taken me. I write in a hurry. If these lines are found, know that I was forced to be a witness to things I should not have seen. Forgive me, for I could not keep silent. T. Weller." A silence fell, broken only by Lady Hatherley's quiet sob. She had entered quietly, and now sank into a chair, her hands pressed to her lips. Sir Reginald, however, hit the desk with his fist. "Lies! A servant's trick to hide his own betrayal. Holmes looked at him with that calm intensity which could frighten even the bravest. "On the contrary, Sir Reginald, these words have the mark of truth, the hurried handwriting of a man in danger, the desperate plea of one who knows his life is hanging by a thread. Weller did not run away from you. He was taken, and he was taken because he stumbled upon secrets too dangerous for a footman to carry." Sir Reginald's face darkened, but Holmes turned from him to Lady Hatherley. "Madam, your silence has weighed heavily on you. But silence cannot change the truth. There are letters, papers hidden still, which hold the key. If you want to see this matter ended, you must trust me." Her eyes filled with tears. For a long moment she hesitated. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached into her dress and pulled out a folded packet. "I could not destroy them," she whispered. "They are not mine to burn. They came into Thomas's hands by chance, and when he showed them to me in fear, I knew they would bring ruin. My husband told me to say nothing, but I can bear it no longer." Holmes took the packet gently, his eyes flashing as he saw the seals and signatures. "So," he murmured, "the curtain is lifted. These are no family matters. They are important letters, proof of deals that, if known, would shake both Parliament and the newspapers." He slipped them into his pocket. The footman was silenced because he saw too much. But in his silence he left behind a voice, the confession we hold now. At that moment a commotion was heard from the hall, and Inspector Lestrade entered with 2 police officers. His sharp eyes darted to the note, and then to Holmes. "So you found it, have you?" "Well, Holmes, the police will see it through from here." Holmes's reply was quiet, but firm. "The police may claim the credit, Lestrade, but mark my words, the true villain has yet to be unmasked. Weller's disappearance is just the outward sign. The hand that guided the carriage, that burnt the papers, that threatened this household, that is the hand you must catch." Lestrade frowned, but said nothing, his gaze fixed on Sir Reginald, who stood stiff and pale. But it was Lady Hatherley who spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "Do not look at my husband alone. There are others, men who came cloaked in night, who spoke in whispers by the servants' door. They used this house as their meeting place, and when Thomas overheard them, they struck him down. My husband was guilty in his silence, but not in the act." The revelation stunned us all, though Holmes's expression showed no surprise. He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to show the fog-covered street beyond. "The men who drove that carriage to Wapping are still free. They believe the footman is dead or silenced forever. But his words, though written in a hurry, have survived. They will hang like a sword above their heads." The rest of the evening passed in confusion, Sir Reginald protesting he was innocent, Lady Hatherley weeping in relief and terror, Lestrade bustling with official power. At last Holmes and I left, the packet of letters safe in his pocket, and the confession folded carefully inside his coat. As we stepped once more into the night, the fog closed around us like a blanket. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice low, "the boy is gone. We must accept that. Whether he drowned in the river or is buried in some unmarked grave, we may never know. But his voice remains, and through it, justice will speak. The web of secrets that trapped him will unravel, and the men who thought he was just a pawn will find themselves exposed." I could not answer at once, for my heart was heavy with pity for poor Thomas Weller. At last I said, "It seems cruel, Holmes, that a life so simple should end so violently just for crossing the path of greater men." Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lamplight as we turned toward Baker Street. "Cruel indeed, my dear fellow, but such is the nature of truth in London. The smallest gear can stop the grandest wheel, and the hand of a footman may shake the halls of power. Let us be thankful that though he was silenced, he spoke enough to leave us his confession. And so the case of the vanished footman came to its end, though not to its final punishment." For even as the fog swallowed us that night, I knew, as did Holmes, that London held 1,000 more secrets, each waiting to knock upon our door.